This episode of Game Masters Hall is sponsored by The Deck of Many and Level Up Dice.
Hello and welcome to Game Masters Hall. I'm Kelly Lynn D'Angelo and I am here today with David Nett to talk about creative and inventive ways to use your spells. David, hello! Thank you
Kelly.
so much for joining me.
You're very welcome.
Very, very excited to have you today. We're going to just dive right into it. I am just incredibly curious about many things having to do with spells. Spells can become an integral part of anybody's DM experience or GM experience. And I would love to know, first and foremost, a little bit about your background with spell usage as a DM. Let's get into it.
So, I mean, as a player in the beginning, my first player character, because I was 12 and the Unearthed Arcana had just come out and I couldn't decide, I played a fighter mage thief, which is a terrible choice in first edition, but it was my choice. But the first thing I ever did in a game ever was cast a spell. So my party had ridden up, we were riding through the snowy wastes and we were attacked by a giant riding a mastodon. The first thing I ever did was cast Melf's Minute Meteors. So, which is it's a wonderful spell and such a colorful, flavorful, little meteors flying. I hoped to burn the mastodon's fur. It didn't work, and I was knocked unconscious immediately. But so spells were the first thing I ever did in D&D. And I played, throughout the time I was playing and then moving into game mastering, I played mostly wizards and paladins. I love magic. Part of the reason that I play fantasy role-playing games primarily is because magic is one of the things that I really am attracted to.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's so cool to know that that's like a core love of yours.
Yeah, and so all of the worlds that I build, the games that I play, they're usually centered around either the rise of magic, a fall of magic. Even if it's a low magic world, the presence or lack thereof is a critical part of the game. I think, especially when you're playing fantasy role-playing games, which is my primary thing, magic is at the core of what makes it, a fantasy game to me.
I'm curious, especially from the behind-the-screen kind of experience. I want to know first and foremost, when you run your games, do you tend to have a lot of spellcasters within them?
Yeah, so from a villains and NPC standpoint, yeah. Again, because magic is so central to all of the fantasy games that I run, typically the villain is going to be either a spellcaster or accompanied by a spellcaster advisor or something. I don't think I've ever created an adventure where there wasn't some aspect of that in it. So yeah, it's an important part of the games because magic is wonderful and powerful and an incredible tool for the players, an incredible way to get into fantasy. It's also terrifying. I mean, the fundamental underlying idea of it is there are things we don't understand. And even if you're plucking at the threads, I love in 5th edition D&D, and I talk about D&D a lot because that's the main game I play. Yeah. But I love in 5th edition that they've embraced sort of the Forgotten Realms idea of the weave, of the interface between the magical realm and what we're able to draw from it.
Yeah.
Because we talk a lot, I've always talked a lot about plucking the threads of chaos and harnessing the primal forces, and this idea that we're going to reach into something that we don't understand and pull a little bit out and hope that everything works out. I mean, it can be scary, it can be exhilarating. It's so wonderful.
I love everything. I think there's so many interesting things that have happened within the history, too, of that world and that space and the gods within them, like Mystra and the Celestial Stairway and the Spell Plague and what happened from 4th into 5th edition of D&D. There's just some really interesting cause and effects of magic usage within the world. And so it's very interesting to know that you're kind of about the balance itself. In some ways, you become a microcosm of kind of what D&D has been trying to finesse and balance, and now they've achieved pretty much perfectly. I mean, I must say, I kind of love spellcasting and playing a spellcaster in the games.
They've done a really good job in the recent editions. I mean, the thing that you talked about sort of the gods and the balance of the world hanging on that magic, I think about the early Dris Do'Urden books, right? The early R.A. Salvatore books, and that's the first time as a young reader that I sort of experienced that place in the fantasy realm. But I always look back to Gandalf myself and
Harry Potter for me.
Yeah, there you go. But I think about a lot. When the movies came out, I had so many friends that were like, Gandalf doesn't do anything. Gandalf's not powerful at all. I'm like, no, Gandalf is powerful in a way that's difficult to understand, and Gandalf is ancient in a way that's difficult to understand, and his motivations and how he intervenes. You're not meant to really understand understand it. Tolkien was trying to create a mystery around that. And for me, the villains and NPCs in my games, a lot of that lives in that, Gandalf realm.
Oh, that's so interesting. So in certain ways, it's almost that magic in and of itself becomes a plot point within the story.
Absolutely.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
So I guess then as a DM who's crafting and creating stories with spellcasters and high-level spellcasters at that, knowing that your party is going to have to defeat them or at least attempt to defeat them at some point, what's kind of a magic or a property or school of magic that you kind of lean on? Is there ones that are like planar travel? Is that kind of your thing? Is it more staying grounded in reality and using high-level elemental-based spells? Like, I'm curious as to what that might look like.
One of the most intriguing schools for me is Enchantment. Because I think it's underused a lot because it isn't flashy, it isn't, it's not evocation, or it's not fireballs and, power word kills and things like that. It's more subtle. And I think in a lot of ways, especially when you're talking about villains, it becomes scarier in that sense. The idea of, minor bad guys or whatever under the thrall of someone else, the idea that you can lose your own agency in the process of, confronting a bad guy. That's I think a terrifying thing and a visceral thing that we all understand, at least instinctually. And so for me, Enchantment is a really sort of an underused but very powerful tool for villains. We tend to think about the necromancer or whatever and the power of the undead, but for me, Enchantment is, I think, a really horrifying and scary idea.
And it sounds like you kind of use it in your story in some ways to like get at the core of what these characters might represent, especially as they gain power using things such as enchantment or being able to manipulate spells, manipulate memory or mind control and things of that sort. It can serve as a great plot point. So can you kind of tell me specifically certain moments that in order to craft really great plot, maybe certain spells you've used before at the table? Like that sounds like very specific. You could have had one person taken over and fight against a fellow friend.
Sure. I mean, that's I think the classic one. But I think that the simplest and when you're talking about how it fits into the overall story are charmed characters, right? So not the PCs necessarily being charmed, but if the villain has charmed other people around them and the PCs encountering someone who is behaving strangely or behaving in a way that doesn't seem to be in their interest and running down the path of motivation and figuring out they are being controlled by someone else. I think, again, in the idea of things being scary, just a simple thing like a charmed person spell, which in almost all the games where you see that spell reflected is usually a pretty low-level spell, a spell where you're not asking someone to act against their normal character, but you're nudging them towards something that maybe is in character for them. That again, it can be, I think, really insidious and really terrifying once you figure out what's going on.
So there's almost a puzzle complex within the actual spells themselves.
Yeah,
so you can use something low level to forward a story in a much greater way.
Well, and I think the idea of a spell that is in existence that didn't just happen. So a character not seeing a bad guy cast a spell or something, but rather realizing that someone is under the effect of a spell. It's a different kind of situation because it adds a level of mystery and a little bit of danger because you're not sure where that spell came from. Something like command, very straightforward. You've been commanded to do something, you drop your weapon or whatever, or some other kind of a mind control spell in the middle of combat where you, as you say, force one player to attack another player. Those things are a little bit more obvious because they happen in a moment, but the lingering effects of, some kind of mind control or some kind of charm spell can be a really cool catalyst to story.
Has there ever been an instance that one of your players have maybe used one of their spells very inventively or creatively, and it kind of like you had to figure out how to exactly react to that in some sort of way?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, actually, so one of my recent campaigns, was probably maybe 6 months ago, one of my players, they're about 3rd level, and he's playing a cleric, and he had made some bad decisions and ended up in an interrogation room with a couple of the bad guys from the story.
We've all been there.
Yeah, exactly. And he's by himself and he's getting roughed up a little bit. And he's a cleric, but he's a cleric of the Forge. And so they rough him up a little bit, ask him some questions. He doesn't know the answers. They keep beating on him a little bit, and then they leave the room and leave him alone while they go do some other nefarious stuff. And he's trapped in this room. And I was actually really concerned. He's a new player. He's a delightful person. He loves this cleric character. The cleric's name is Norman, Norman Fetch. And so, but he's stuck in this room, and I was really sure that we might lose this. I figured we might lose this character because I didn't see a lot of ways out for him from this, and I have to continue the story in a way that makes sense for the story. The other characters weren't intervening at this point. They didn't even know what had happened. It was looking grim for him. But they left him alone in the room, and he's a cleric of the Forge. And so he used this power. He's got a power called Artisan's Blessing, where you can take a certain amount of metal and transform that into something useful over the course of an hour.
That's a new build, right?
So it's from the Domain of the Forge in Xanathar's Guide in 5e.
Cool.
And so he can find basically an amount of metal that's equal to the thing he wants to make, and then he can make a simple weapon or simple object just out of that, just from his mind over the course of an hour. And so while he was sitting in the room, he asked me, can I make a dagger to defend myself? And I said, well, you're alone in a room. It's a wooden table or wooden chairs, and the door is locked. And then he said, can I use the hinges of the door to make this dagger, simultaneously releasing myself and making this dagger? And technically in the book it says you need to lay out the metal, but this is a place where like I'm more than willing to play fast and loose, and because I was happy for him to discover a way out of this and a very inventive use of this Artisan's Blessing. And so he sat in the chair and concentrated for this hour while he was left alone, and he used the metal in the hinges to make himself a dagger so he was armed and to allow himself to get out of the room. Like I said, I was delighted. It wasn't what I expected at all. I was delighted for him. It's a story that I love because it was utterly unexpected to me. It isn't what that power is meant for necessarily, the people who created it, but it's such a broad, open idea that it shows sort of the breadth of how these things can be used. And I think it happens more honestly with newer players than with older players, experience-wise, I mean, not age-wise, because when you're brand new, you don't have a lot of preconceived ideas about what these things do.
Yeah.
And your mind's are more flexible. Exactly.
Don't you?
And so he was able to make that leap with something that I, having played for all these years and having read that thing, would have never thought of.
Thank you so much, David, for meeting with me today. It was an amazing conversation. I feel like I learned so much about myself.
Thank you, Kelly. That's kind. Me too.
And before we wrap up, we're going to go to Xander, who's with Emily of Level Up Dice.
Thanks, Kelly. You're one of my favorite module writers ever. Hey, Emily.
Hi.
What you got for me today?
Today, I want to talk about what happens when we go beyond the basic design of the dice.
Okay.
Beyond the material of the dice.
Uh-huh.
Beyond the font of the dice.
What's left?
Magic.
Okay.
I'm so excited to show you something really unique, really special. These are our Toon Touch titanium dice.
Okay.
So what happens is each of these dice starts out as a solid titanium dice that's going to be that silver color you'd associate with titanium.
Sure.
As we apply heat to it, the metal actually reacts to the heat and turns into this sort of rainbowy spectrum of colors over time. Now you have a really short window to work with the heat to get that color. It kind of cycles through blue, purple, and gold before it turns sort of a whitish color. And in that time, you've got to get the color consistent, not just on all sides of the dice, but also across the entire set of the dice.
Oh, it's all at once.
Yeah, it's a lot easier said than done.
Yeah.
It's quite a lot of work. So our Flame Touch artist has really perfected this method to get themed colors like the beautiful pastels that you see in this set here.
Wow.
But what takes that beautiful design even a step further is the Toon Touched element.
Okay, go on.
So, our Flame Touch artist actually listens to music and uses the music to influence the design with the flame.
I love this.
So the song is literally infused into the dice.
Oh my god! Okay,
Yeah.
so is it the same song for all of it?
Nope, we never use the same song twice.
What?
So this, for example, is our candy dice.
Uh-huh, okay.
And we do take special requests, of course. We've had people do amazing things like get their wedding song for their partner infused into the set of dice.
That's adorable.
And now I'll show you mine are my special preciouses. These are my Chiari Pamu Fashion Monster dice.
Oh, nice. I like Pom Pom Way Pom Pom, but that's fine.
Yeah, it's okay. Her whole oeuvre has a
There
lot
it is.
within.
Yeah.
But that being said, this is an amazing way to really take that unique, customized feeling of the dice a step farther and add another aspect of the senses into the dice that you roll with.
Have you done the Nyan Cat song yet?
Not yet.
Claiming it.
Is that your request? Mm-hmm. I'll get right on that.
Thank you. Well, this really is magic. And speaking of magic, back to you, Kelly.
Thank you so much, Xander and Emily. Also, our friends at the Deck of Many have some very new, cool animated spell cards, so be sure to check them out, animatedspells.com. Thank you so much, David, for talking with me today. It was an awesome conversation.
It was super fun. Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Yes.
Thank you.
More talk soon. And
Yes.
speaking of which, you're speaking with someone as well.
Yeah, I'll be back next week with Jasmine Bular talking about spells some more, which is super exciting. Jasmine is awesome, so yeah.
Can't wait. I'll be watching it. Spells, spells, spells. Thanks so much. And thank you for watching. Until next time.